Isabella Jones stood in the sleek, polished terminal of the airport, her gaze steady, her posture poised. Her heels clicked against the marble floor as she walked, each step echoing her confidence. She was a young entrepreneur, the kind of woman who commanded attention without needing to demand it. She had built her business from the ground up, navigating every obstacle with a blend of determination and grace. But today, this was not about business. This was about a quiet but important victory in her own life, and she intended to savor it. Her dark, curly hair cascaded down her back, a sharp contrast to her tailored black suit. The leather bag in her hand looked expensive, refined, just like her. She held her first-class ticket with the quiet pride of someone who had earned this luxury, though it wasn't something she often allowed herself to indulge in. Today was different. She had every right to be here. As she approached the gate, she gave a brief nod to the gate attendant who, upon recognizing her ticket, ushered her through with a respectful smile. Isabella's calm composure never faltered, even as she could feel the curious gazes of other passengers flicking over her. Their eyes were not unkind, but they betrayed an unmistakable surprise. She was aware of the quiet whispers that seemed to follow her as she walked down the aisle of the aircraft. But she kept her head high, ignoring them with the practiced ease of someone who had become used to feeling like an outsider, no matter the room she entered. Isabella reached her seat in the first class section and slid into it gracefully. She placed her bag in the overhead compartment, then settled into the plush seat. Her fingers drummed briefly against the armrest, a slight gesture of impatience, though it wasn't because she was anxious. No, she was simply a woman who liked to have control over her surroundings. She pulled out a notebook from her bag and began to jot down a few thoughts. The hum of the plane starting to taxi was soothing, but her mind was already several steps ahead. She had worked too hard to let anything or anyone disrupt her peace. As Isabella focused on her notes, unaware of the escalating tension around her, a tall, stern-looking woman walked briskly down the aisle. Sarah Park, the flight attendant, was nothing like the others. Where most attendants smiled and greeted passengers with warmth, Sarah's expression was sharp, calculated. She moved with purpose, a certain coldness in her movements that gave away nothing about her thoughts. But Isabella noticed her the moment she stopped by her seat. "Excuse me." Sarah's voice was polite, but carried an unmistakable edge. "Can I see your boarding pass?" Isabella looked up, surprised, but not flustered. "Of course," she said smoothly, offering the ticket. "Is something wrong?" Sarah scanned the pass with a practiced eye, but her brow furrowed as she scrutinized it. She held the pass a moment longer than necessary before handing it back. "This is for first class, yes?" "Yes," Isabella answered simply, her voice steady, her calm demeanor unwavering. But Sarah didn't respond immediately. She lingered for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly. Isabella could tell that something about her didn't sit right with Sarah, but she chose to ignore it. There would be time for explanations later if they were even necessary. The moment passed as Sarah walked away, but not without casting a glance over her shoulder, her eyes still suspicious, though she said nothing further. Isabella returned to her notebook, her pen moving steadily across the paper, her mind clearly focused on the task at hand. But this quiet interaction had already begun to stir the tension beneath the surface. Sarah had not missed something. She had seen exactly what she expected to see, and what she saw in her mind didn't belong in first class. Minutes passed. The plane began to accelerate, its engines humming with a rhythm that Isabella had come to find comforting. But this calm was short-lived. A few rows ahead, Sarah stood with another flight attendant, whispering to her in hushed tones. Isabella could feel her gaze on the back of her neck, the subtle shift in energy that rippled through the cabin. Then, without warning, Sarah returned, this time with a purposeful stride that carried an unspoken authority. "Miss Jones, could you step aside for a moment?" she asked, her tone colder this time. Isabella raised an eyebrow, not at all rattled, but aware that something was changing. "I'm sorry. What's the matter?" she asked politely, gathering her things. "I need to verify something," Sarah said, folding her arms in a manner that left little room for negotiation. Her eyes hardened. "It seems there may have been a mistake with your booking." Isabella frowned, the calm on her face faltering slightly. "A mistake? I booked this seat weeks ago, and I received a confirmation. Sarah's lips pressed together, her gaze unflinching. I've checked the system. You'll need to move to a different seat. Isabella's eyes narrowed just slightly, her brain working swiftly to process the implications of this, but she said nothing. Instead, she gathered her belongings slowly, deliberately, her mind racing. Why would I need to move? Isabella asked, her voice soft but firm, a quiet challenge buried beneath the politeness. I don't have time to explain, Sarah responded in a near whisper. Either you move or I'll have to call security. A flash of disbelief crossed Isabella's face, but it disappeared almost immediately. There was a brief, silent moment between them. Then Isabella nodded, her decision made. All right, I'll move, she said, her tone clipped. The dim hum of the airplane's engines filled the cabin as the plane climbed into the sky, its wings cutting through the clouds. Isabella, seated in the cramped middle seat of the economy section, leaned back against the headrest, doing her best to settle into her new surroundings. She couldn't quite shake the sense of unease that had followed her after the encounter with Sarah. But Isabella was no stranger to discomfort. She had learned to thrive in it. Still, this was different. She had been humiliated, forced to move to a seat that didn't reflect the value of her ticket. And it wasn't just the inconvenience that bothered her, it was the judgment that came with it. The way Sarah had eyed her as though she didn't belong in a place where people like her were supposed to be. Isabella had seen it all before, the subtle, almost invisible barriers that were erected when people like Sarah assumed they knew who belonged where. She straightened up, glancing around the cabin, where passengers were still whispering about the exchange. The murmurs were louder now, with some passengers throwing furtive glances in her direction, while others pretended not to notice. They were all curious about the woman who had been forcibly moved from the plush, comfortable first-class cabin to the crowded, noisy back. Isabella sighed, opening her leather bag and pulling out her phone. She unlocked the screen and typed quickly, her fingers moving with swift precision over the keys. The message she sent was brief but deliberate, a signal, one that would make all the difference. Meanwhile, Sarah was making her rounds through the cabin, checking on passengers, offering drinks, and keeping an eye on the rest of the crew. But her mind kept drifting back to the woman in seat 35B, the woman she had ordered to move. The entire interaction had left a sour taste in her mouth. Sarah prided herself on her ability to maintain control of every situation, to read people and know their place. And yet, something about Isabella's presence, her calm demeanor, her refusal to escalate, had shaken Sarah in a way she couldn't quite understand. It wasn't just that Isabella hadn't reacted the way Sarah had expected, but there was something else. As Sarah walked past the galley, she exchanged a few words with Clara, a fellow flight attendant. Clara had been the first to notice how tense things were between Sarah and Isabella. She gave Sarah a pointed look as though she could tell that Sarah was struggling with the situation. Are you okay? Clara asked, her voice a quiet murmur. I'm fine, Sarah replied quickly, brushing her off. Just some confusion with a passenger. Clara didn't buy it. You don't look fine. You've been acting a little off. I don't know. Maybe it's just me. Sarah shot her a sharp glance. I'm handling it. Don't worry about it. But as Sarah walked away, her unease only deepened. There was something about Isabella, something that Sarah couldn't place, and it was driving her mad. Back in the economy cabin, Isabella sat still, her gaze focused on her phone. She had made the call, and now it was time to wait. Every second that ticked by seemed to drag on, but she was patient. The wheels of change were already in motion. She knew it wouldn't be long before Sarah felt the pressure of the storm she had unknowingly helped to create. Isabella's thoughts drifted back to the conversation she'd had with her friend at the human rights organization just before the flight. She had explained the situation as clearly as she could, though she had left out the details of her plan. What she wanted was simple: a fair resolution to the incident. Yes, but more importantly, she wanted to shed light on the underlying prejudice that Sarah's actions had revealed. This wasn't about personal revenge. It was about change. It was about showing people like Sarah that they couldn't just judge others based on their assumptions. And Isabella was perfectly equipped to fight this battle. She glanced at her watch, her finger tapping absently on the screen. The message she had sent wasn't the end of it, just the beginning. She had a long way to go before she could say that things had truly changed. As the flight continued, Sarah couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. Every time she walked past Isabella, she felt an unsettling stillness in the air. Isabella wasn't like the other passengers. She wasn't raising her voice or demanding an explanation. She was just waiting. And it was this quiet resolve, this calm, that unsettled Sarah the most. She had worked with many people before, some wealthy, some not, some important, others not so much, but none of them had ever carried themselves quite like Isabella. She was unassuming in appearance, yet there was something about her that felt significant. It wasn't just that Isabella had money, it was the way she handled herself. Sarah had assumed that people who sat in first class were the ones who were entitled to it, people who had the right to be there. But Isabella didn't fit the mold. Her thoughts were interrupted by the faintest, buzzing sound from her pocket. Sarah reached into her apron, pulling out her phone. A message. It was from her manager. The incident with the passenger in 35 has been flagged. Be prepared for a debrief when we land. The words felt like a punch in the stomach. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She had tried to move past it, tried to convince herself that everything was fine, but this message, this was something else. Her stomach twisted as the reality began to sink in. She had made a mistake, and now it was too late to undo it. The plane cruised smoothly through the sky, the noise of the engines providing a rhythmic backdrop to the tension building in the cabin. Isabella remained calm, still, her focus never wavering from her phone. She glanced up occasionally, but her eyes never lingered on anyone for too long. It wasn't that she was avoiding confrontation. She simply didn't need to engage with people who didn't understand her purpose. And then, as if on cue, Sarah walked past again, her footsteps heavier this time, her eyes darting nervously toward Isabella. For the briefest moment, their eyes locked. Isabella didn't smile or scowl, she simply met her gaze. There was no malice in her expression, but there was something else, an understanding. Isabella knew that this was the moment when things would begin to shift. It wasn't about winning a petty argument, it was about exposing the truth. The faint light from the airplane's overhead screens flickered above as the flight continued its steady climb through the sky. Despite the turbulence of the situation, Isabella remained perfectly composed in her new seat. She had been moved to the middle row of the cramped economy section, but her posture never wavered. She sat tall, her back straight, her eyes occasionally scanning the flight's progress on her screen, but her mind was elsewhere, focused. Her fingers danced over her phone's screen once again, typing with purpose. She had sent a message to her contact in the human rights organization earlier, explaining the gravity of the situation. She had made it clear. This wasn't just about a mistake in seating. This was about something deeper, an ingrained bias that was more pervasive than it seemed. Isabella had been in these situations before, and she knew how to navigate the system. She understood the importance of keeping a low profile while setting the gears of change into motion. She finished typing and sent the message, then leaned back in her seat, her gaze momentarily lifting toward the ceiling. She wasn't looking for trouble, but she knew that trouble was coming, and when it did, she would be ready. Sarah couldn't focus. Her mind kept drifting back to the incident with the woman in 35B, the one who had been so calm, so composed, despite being humiliated. The woman's quiet dignity had unsettled Sarah more than she cared to admit. Every time she walked past Isabella, she felt a growing unease gnawing at her. It wasn't just about the seating mix-up anymore. There was something more, something that made Sarah feel small. As she moved through the cabin, handing out drinks and checking on passengers, she couldn't shake the feeling that Isabella was doing something she couldn't quite pinpoint. There was an aura of control about her, a subtle power that was impossible to ignore. Sarah tried to focus on the task at hand. There were plenty of other things she could be doing, but her eyes kept drifting toward Isabella, who appeared utterly at ease, her phone in hand, typing, but always with a calm that felt too calculated. The whispers of the other passengers didn't help. They had been talking about it, about the strange request, the unjustified relocation. Some were sympathetic, others curious, but all had noticed the uncomfortable shift in the atmosphere. Sarah could feel it. The eyes of the cabin were on her, and they weren't kind. As Sarah passed by the galley, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from her manager. Sarah, we need a report on the incident as soon as we land. Be ready for a debrief. Her heart skipped a beat. She had expected some fallout, but this felt different. This wasn't just about a mistake anymore. It was about something bigger, something she wasn't prepared for. Isabella sat in her seat, seemingly unfazed by the growing tension. She knew that Sarah's actions weren't random. They were a direct reflection of the biases that had been ingrained in people like her for years. But Isabella also knew that these biases weren't always easy to challenge. That's why she had taken a different approach. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't argued with Sarah in front of the passengers. She had been calm, collected, and most importantly, she had set her plan into motion. The wheels were already turning. The message she had sent earlier had gone through to her contact at the Human Rights Organization, and Isabella could already sense the ripple effect beginning. The organization would begin investigating the incident, and the airline would soon be under scrutiny. But for now, she needed to wait. And as she waited, she remained composed, never once allowing herself to slip into frustration or anger. In this battle, she knew that patience was her greatest weapon. Isabella glanced at the flight attendants passing by. Sarah was nowhere to be seen, and Isabella couldn't help but wonder what was going through her mind. She didn't care to know, not really. What mattered was what happened next. The flight continued, and Sarah found herself becoming more restless with each passing moment. The quiet hum of the engines couldn't drown out the anxiety gnawing at her. Every time she passed Isabella, she felt the weight of her stare, though Isabella never looked up from her phone. There was something eerily unbothered about her, and it made Sarah uneasy. Why wasn't she reacting the way other passengers might have? Why wasn't she raising a fuss, demanding an apology, threatening legal action? As Sarah moved past Isabella again, she caught sight of the woman's phone screen, her fingers dancing quickly over the keyboard. It was a brief, almost imperceptible glance, but it was enough. Something about the way Isabella typed, so purposeful, so certain, made Sarah feel exposed. It was as if Isabella was in control, orchestrating something she hadn't yet fully understood. Sarah could feel the weight of her actions settling upon her. She had assumed that her role as a flight attendant meant she was in control, that she had the authority to make decisions. But now, as she felt the eyes of the passengers on her, as the whispers grew louder, she realized just how wrong she was. This wasn't just about a misplaced seat. This was about a woman who had challenged Sarah's assumptions, who had quietly yet firmly taken control of the situation. The moment finally arrived. As the plane neared its cruising altitude, Isabella's phone buzzed again. She glanced down at the screen, reading the brief message. It was from her contact. The airline has been notified. Be prepared. A small smile tugged at the corners of Isabella's lips. The groundwork had been laid. The dominoes were in motion. She leaned back in her seat, allowing the message to sink in. This wasn't just about a personal victory. This was about showing the world that people like Sarah, people who assumed they could dictate others' worth, would be held accountable. And Isabella had made sure of it. She closed her eyes briefly, allowing the hum of the airplane to soothe her nerves. There was no turning back now. Sarah walked down the aisle again, but this time her steps were slower, more deliberate. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was happening, something that she hadn't prepared for. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a notification from the airline's internal messaging system. The words seemed to jump out at her. Immediate debrief upon landing. Incident with passenger 35B flagged for review. Her stomach churned. The tension that had been building up all flight long finally exploded within her. The realization hit her hard. Her actions were being scrutinized. There was no escaping it now. As she passed Isabella once again, their eyes met. This time, Isabella's gaze was steady, unflinching. It wasn't triumphant, but it was certain. Sarah couldn't read her expression completely, but there was a quiet strength in it that made Sarah feel small. The plane descended smoothly through the clouds, the hum of the engines a constant presence in the cabin. Isabella sat back in her seat, eyes closed for a moment as she gathered her thoughts. Her strategy was in motion, And though the end game was still far away, she could already feel the weight of change shifting beneath her. The small, steady smile that had appeared on her lips earlier remained, and yet her calmness masked a deep, focused determination. The world had a way of making people like Sarah believe they were invincible. But Isabella knew the truth. Everyone had a breaking point. And today, Sarah was about to meet hers. Isabella's fingers drummed against the armrest, a subtle rhythm that only she noticed. Her mind moved faster than the plane ever could, running through all the steps she had taken so far. She had contacted the Human Rights Organization, set the plan into motion, and now the only thing left to do was wait for the inevitable. She glanced at Sarah, who was walking up the aisle again, delivering drinks with an air of unease. Sarah's movements were tense, more deliberate than usual. Isabella had seen this kind of behavior before, nervous energy of someone who knew they were being watched, but couldn't fully grasp the extent of the consequences. Sarah had always been confident in her role as a flight attendant. She had prided herself on her ability to maintain control, to handle every situation with professionalism and grace. But now, as she moved through the cabin, she couldn't shake the feeling that things were slipping away from her. Her gaze flickered over to Isabella once again, who was staring straight ahead, her expression unreadable. Sarah had tried to move past the incident with the seating mix-up, to pretend that it was just an isolated mistake. But every time she passed by Isabella, every time she saw that quiet resolve, she felt the cracks in her facade deepen. She had grown accustomed to making decisions based on assumptions about who belonged where, about who deserved what. It was how she had survived in a job that demanded quick judgment. But today, something was different. Isabella wasn't the typical passenger. She wasn't reacting the way Sarah had expected. She was too calm, too composed. Sarah could feel the weight of the passengers' eyes on her, their silent judgment pressing in from every angle. They had all witnessed what had happened. Some had quietly sided with Isabella, others had remained silent, but none of them were forgetting. And that made Sarah feel more exposed than she ever had before. As the flight progressed, the tension in the air became palpable. Isabella could sense Sarah's growing discomfort, even as the flight attendant continued with her duties. Sarah had become distracted, her movements stiff and forced. Isabella couldn't help but watch her, studying the cracks in Sarah's professional armor. It was clear that Sarah was unraveling, but she wasn't ready to admit it yet. Isabella remained calm, never letting on that she was aware of the growing disarray around her. She had expected this. People like Sarah were trained to uphold a system, to believe that their authority was absolute. But when that system was challenged, when their assumptions were proven wrong, it was always the hardest for them to accept. Isabella reached into her bag, pulling out a notebook. She made a few quick notes in it, her pen moving steadily across the page. It was a small act, but one that symbolized everything she was working toward. Change didn't come with loud protests or dramatic gestures. It came with patience, precision, and quiet action. Her phone buzzed again, and Isabella unlocked it with a swift movement. She read the new message from her contact. The airline has begun its investigation. They will review the incident upon landing. Prepare yourself. A sense of satisfaction settled over Isabella. The wheels of justice were turning, and Sarah had unknowingly set the course in motion. Isabella didn't want revenge. She didn't even want to escalate the situation. She simply wanted to make sure that people like Sarah, people who believed they could discriminate without consequence, knew that their actions would be held accountable. As the plane began its descent, Sarah's anxiety reached its peak. She had tried to focus on the tasks at hand, but her mind kept drifting back to the incident. The message from her manager earlier in the flight still lingered in her thoughts. Immediate debrief upon landing. The fact that the airline had flagged the incident, that she was being questioned about her actions, filled her with dread. Sarah had worked for years to build her reputation as a reliable and competent flight attendant, but now she realized how easily it could all come crashing down. And it was all because of one moment, one decision, that had spiraled out of control. Sarah walked past Isabella again, trying to maintain her composure, but her eyes betrayed her. For the first time, she felt vulnerable. The calmness in Isabella's gaze made her feel like a child again, exposed and insignificant. Isabella had no anger, no animosity, only a quiet strength that left Sarah feeling powerless. As Sarah passed by, their eyes met again, and this time Sarah couldn't look away. Isabella's expression didn't change. It wasn't smug or confrontational, it was simply knowing. Isabella knew that Sarah was starting to grasp the consequences of her actions. She knew that the moment of reckoning was approaching. The plane landed smoothly, its wheels hitting the tarmac with a reassuring bump. The usual post-landing rush began, passengers unbuckling their seatbelts, gathering their things, and preparing to exit the aircraft. But Sarah was not among them. She remained in the galley, nervously checking her phone and waiting for something, anything, that might tell her how this was going to play out. She had hoped, deep down, that it would blow over, that it was all just a misunderstanding. But the way Isabella had remained so composed, so sure of herself, it told Sarah that this was not something that would simply disappear. Just as Sarah was about to step into the aisle, two security officers appeared at the entrance of the cabin. They scanned the room with professional detachment, their eyes landing on Sarah. "Are you Sarah Park?" one of the officers asked, his voice firm. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She swallowed, trying to steady her nerves. "Yes, I am," she replied, her voice barely audible. The officer's gaze never wavered. "We've been instructed to escort you for questioning. The airline has received a formal complaint about an incident with a first-class passenger. You'll need to provide a detailed report after landing." The plane had landed, but for Sarah, the journey was far from over. As the other passengers disembarked, chatting amongst themselves, Sarah remained in the galley, her hands trembling slightly as she cleaned up the final trays. Her heart was still pounding from the tense moment when the security officers had approached her. She had thought it was just a misunderstanding, a small error that would be quickly brushed aside. But now, she realized the gravity of the situation. She glanced nervously at the door, where the two officers had disappeared with a promise to return shortly. Her mind raced, replaying every detail of the flight. Could she have done something differently? Was there a way to undo the damage she had caused? But deep down, Sarah knew the truth. There was no turning back now. Isabella had already stood up and retrieved her bag from the overhead compartment as the plane began to empty. She walked down the aisle with purpose, not once glancing at Sarah, who remained in the galley avoiding eye contact. Isabella knew that the moment she had been waiting for was drawing closer. The airline would have to take action, and with that, change would follow. But she wasn't in a rush. She knew that the process of making real, lasting change didn't happen overnight. She had already made her peace with the fact that the conflict would get messier before it could be resolved. But that was part of the fight. It was about pushing people like Sarah, people who believed that authority and preconceived notions could be wielded without consequence, to finally recognize their bias. As Isabella stepped off the plane, her phone buzzed again. A message from her contact. "The investigation is being initiated. Be prepared for a follow-up." She smiled quietly to herself. This was just the beginning. Once the plane was empty, Sarah was finally called into the back office by the security officers. They walked her down the narrow corridors of the airport with stern expressions, their steps echoing in the otherwise silent space. Sarah's stomach churned with every step, her mind flashing back to the way Isabella had handled the entire situation. With grace, with confidence, and with the knowledge that things were never going to be the same again. The officers led Sarah into a small, sterile room and asked her to sit. She did so reluctantly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she tried to steady her breath. The reality of what she had done hit her with full force as she waited. This wasn't just about a minor mistake. It was about her job, her reputation, and the system she had relied on for years. One of the officers, a man in his mid-30s, stood across from her with a notepad. "Miss Park," he began, "we've received a formal complaint regarding your treatment of a passenger earlier today. We need to go over the events in detail." Sarah swallowed hard. She hadn't expected to be interrogated like this. I didn't think it was a big deal," she stammered, her voice shaking. "She was in the wrong seat, and I just had to move her. I thought it was a mistake with her booking." The officer raised an eyebrow. "You thought?" Yes, Sarah replied quickly, a hint of defensiveness in her tone. She didn't seem the type to be flying first class, so I assumed there was an issue. Did you ask her for clarification? Or did you just make an assumption based on her appearance? Sarah paused. The question hung in the air. She didn't have an answer. As the questioning continued, Sarah began to realize just how much her actions had been rooted in assumption, in bias. The officer explained that her behavior had been flagged for review and that the incident was being investigated not just for its immediate effects, but for the broader implications it carried. Your actions, the officer explained, reflect a pattern of behavior that is inconsistent with the standards of this airline. Discrimination, whether conscious or not, is a serious violation. We will be reviewing everything from passenger statements to security footage. The company takes these matters very seriously. Sarah's heart sank as the reality of her situation began to settle in. She had never thought of herself as someone who discriminated, at least not in an overt way. She had been taught that certain people belonged in certain places. It was a lesson she had learned from an early age, a lesson that had been reinforced by her peers, her family, and her job. But now she could see that those lessons had been wrong, and they had cost her everything. Meanwhile, Isabella was already preparing for the next phase. She had given the airline time to process the incident, but now it was time for her to take a more active role. She had been in contact with the airline's executive office, carefully laying out the details of her complaint. She knew that she had to be strategic. She didn't want to tear everything down in one swift move. Instead, she whittled her case, piece by piece, until it became impossible to ignore. As she sat at a cafe near the airport, waiting for her next meeting, Isabella reflected on the path ahead. She knew that change took time. It wasn't enough to make noise. She had to make a statement. The investigation would be the first step, but the real work would begin once the facts were laid bare. It was about more than just Sarah. It was about creating a system where people were treated equally, regardless of their appearance, their background, or their social status. Isabella's phone buzzed again, a reminder that things were progressing. Meeting scheduled for tomorrow at 10 a.m. Be prepared. She stood up, gathering her things with quiet determination. The future was in motion, and there was no turning back now. Hours later, Sarah sat alone in her small apartment, the termination notice from the airline resting on the table before her. Her hands shook as she stared at the words, the reality of her situation sinking in. The hearing had been swift, the decision clear. She had been suspended, pending further review, and the airline had already begun making adjustments to their policies. She had lost everything. But what hurt more than losing her job was the realization that she had been wrong, so terribly wrong. The beliefs that had shaped her actions, the assumptions she had made, had all led to this point. Sarah had thought she was in control. She had believed that her position was secure, that she was untouchable. But now she was the one left exposed. In the end, she realized that the change she had feared wasn't just inevitable, it was necessary. The morning after the hearing was a quiet one for Sarah Park. The heavy weight of the decision hung over her like an oppressive cloud. She had spent the entire night replaying every moment of her actions, every misstep, and every word she had said to Isabella. It was all so clear now, the bias, the assumptions, the arrogance. But it didn't matter. The damage had been done, and she couldn't undo it. The phone call from her manager earlier that morning had been short and to the point. Sarah, you're suspended pending investigation. You'll receive further details soon. No room for negotiation. No second chances. Sarah hadn't even been able to properly process the loss of her job before the next wave of reality hit her. The investigation into the incident would not just be about her actions, it would be about everything that had led to them. The airline was going to overhaul its policies, and the scrutiny would be on everyone. Her actions had exposed a larger issue within the system, one that could no longer be ignored. While Sarah's world crumbled, Isabella's was slowly building toward the change she had worked for. Isabella had always known that systemic issues required more than just a personal confrontation. The airline had to face the truth, and she was prepared to force their hand. Her phone buzzed again, this time with an email notification. She opened it quickly, reading through the message from her contact in the human rights organization. The investigation into her complaint had been initiated, and now the airline had no choice but to address the larger implications of what had happened. It wasn't just about a seating mix up, it was about how discrimination, whether overt or subtle, had been allowed to thrive under the radar. She made a mental note of the upcoming board meeting. The pressure would mount there. She had already requested a seat at the table, and she would not back down. Isabella stood up from her desk, smoothing her tailored jacket. She had come a long way, but now it was time to take this fight to the heart of the issue. She wasn't just going to settle for policy changes. She wanted accountability. She wanted something real to shift, something that could not be undone in a few weeks or months. The airline would need to make a public statement, and the employees responsible for their actions would need to be held accountable. Sarah had arrived at the office early that morning, hoping for some kind of miracle. Maybe, just maybe, if she could explain herself, if she could make them understand that it was all a mistake, she would be able to keep her job. But deep down, she knew that was a fantasy. Her manager, Claire, greeted her coolly as she entered the conference room. Claire didn't waste any time. Sarah, we've had a thorough review of your actions on the flight, and the company has decided to terminate your employment effective immediately. The airline is committed to upholding a standard of equality, and your behavior violated that standard. Claire's words stung, but what hurt more was the sense of being powerless. Sarah hadn't even been given the chance to explain herself fully. All the rationalizations she had made about her behavior seemed so hollow in the face of the reality unfolding before her. She had lost her job, but worse than that, she had lost her place in the world she had carefully built. Claire continued, her voice devoid of empathy. We will, of course, provide a severance package and outplacement assistance, but you are no longer part of this team. We'll be in touch regarding the details. Sarah sat in stunned silence as the meeting concluded, her mind racing. The termination felt like a sharp slap to the face. It wasn't just about losing her job. It was about realizing how deeply entrenched the system of bias was and how it had consumed her without her even fully understanding it. The door closed behind her as Claire left the room, and Sarah was left alone with her thoughts. The weight of her own ignorance crushed her. What had she done? How had she allowed herself to be part of something so harmful? Isabella entered the boardroom with quiet confidence. She had dressed in a sharp black suit, her posture erect, her expression calm but firm. The room was filled with a mix of airline executives, human rights advocates, and members of the company's legal team. The atmosphere was thick with tension, everyone waiting for her to speak. She took a deep breath before addressing the room. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak today, she began, her voice steady and clear. What happened to me on this flight wasn't an isolated incident. It was a manifestation of a much larger problem, an underlying bias that has been allowed to persist in your organization. Isabella's eyes scanned the room, making sure every person in the room understood the gravity of what she was saying. She wasn't here to just air grievances. She was here to make them understand that this was a matter of social justice, and it demanded change. The actions of your flight attendant, while individual, reflect a pattern that affects many others. I don't want to see another passenger humiliated or belittled simply because of who they are, what they look like, or where they come from. Your airline has a responsibility, not only to your passengers, but also to your employees, to create an environment of inclusion and respect. Isabella's words hit like a force, a quiet storm that left no room for denial. The room fell silent as she continued. We need transparency. We need policies that reflect the values of fairness and equality, not assumptions and biases. The actions that were taken against me were a symptom of a much larger issue, one that will only be fixed by addressing it at the core. The tension in the room was palpable, but Isabella stood unwavering. She had said her piece, and now the airline's response would determine if they were truly committed to change. As the meeting unfolded, Sarah sat at home, staring at the termination letter in front of her. Her life had been upended in an instant. What she had once thought was a minor mistake now seemed like the catalyst for everything that had gone wrong. She had lost her job, yes, But more importantly, she had lost her sense of certainty about the world. Everything she had believed about who deserved what, about who should be allowed to sit in the front of the plane, about who belonged in places like first class, had been turned upside down. She realized, now more than ever, that the system she had been a part of had failed her. It had taught her to look at people through a lens of entitlement and prejudice, and it had taken this incident to open her eyes to the harm it caused. Sarah thought about Isabella, the calm, composed woman who had quietly dismantled everything Sarah had believed. She thought about the change that was coming, not just for her, but for the entire industry. It wasn't too late for Sarah to change, too. She wasn't sure where the journey would take her, but she knew one thing for sure: she would never be the same. The morning after the board meeting was one of quiet anticipation for Isabella. She sat at a cafe, her laptop open in front of her as she scanned through the latest developments. The airline's leadership had committed to making changes, but words were only the first step. What mattered now was the action they would take and whether they would follow through on their promises. Her phone buzzed again, this time with an email from the Human Rights Organization. They had received the official report on the incident and were preparing to take further steps. Isabella wasn't surprised, but she felt a sense of relief. The momentum was undeniable. The response from the airline's leadership had been surprisingly swift, though she knew this was just the beginning. They had agreed to implement mandatory training for their staff, focusing on bias awareness and cultural sensitivity. There would be an audit of all company policies to ensure fairness in passenger treatment. And perhaps most importantly, the airline had promised to offer a public apology, not just to Isabella, but to anyone who had been made to feel unwelcome based on assumptions about who they were. This was more than she had expected, but Isabella wasn't done yet. She had to ensure that these changes were enacted meaningfully, not just for optics. She took a sip of her coffee and began drafting an outline for a follow-up meeting. It was time to keep the pressure on. She would be there, making sure that the words on paper translated into lasting change. She wouldn't allow the system to fall back into complacency. The weight of her termination hung heavy in the air as Sarah sat alone in her small apartment. She hadn't told her family yet. She didn't know how to explain it. Her entire life had been built around this job, this identity as a flight attendant who had worked her way up. But in an instant, it had all come crashing down. Her phone had remained silent all morning, and the silence felt suffocating. The shame she felt was unbearable. But as the day wore on, she realized that this wasn't just about losing her career. This was about losing her sense of who she thought she was. For the first time in a long while, Sarah let herself really reflect, on what had happened. She thought to the flight, to the way she had looked at Isabella and made assumptions based solely on her appearance. How had she allowed herself to become so entrenched in a system that judged people by the way they looked or the way they seemed to fit in? As the realization began to sink in, Sarah felt something shift inside of her. This wasn't just a setback, it was an awakening. She hadn't realized how deep the bias ran, how much she had internalized the idea that some people didn't deserve the same treatment as others. She had hurt someone. Worse, she had been part of a system that had allowed her to hurt others, countless others, without even realizing it. The shame still stung, but there was something else too, a desire to make things right. She knew she couldn't undo the past, but she could change the future. The days following the meeting with the board were filled with action. The airline's leadership began taking steps to implement the changes they had promised, starting with an internal announcement that emphasized their commitment to diversity, inclusion, and respect. They introduced new policies to ensure that incidents like the one involving Isabella would be handled with greater sensitivity and awareness. But words alone weren't enough. Isabella knew that. The true test would come in the form of real, measurable change. She worked closely with the airline's diversity committee, attending meetings and offering her expertise on how to address unconscious bias, systemic inequalities, and customer relations. She also kept a close eye on Sarah. She had heard through the grapevine that Sarah was no longer with the airline, but Isabella didn't take pleasure in the news. Yes, Sarah had made a mistake, but Isabella had always believed in accountability, not punishment. She knew that if Sarah was serious about making amends, she would need guidance. She had made a choice once, but now Sarah had the power to make a different choice. Isabella made a mental note to reach out. There was still much work to be done, both within the company and in the broader fight for equality. But this was a start. It was a small victory in a much larger battle. It had been weeks since Sarah had been let go from the airline. The transition was harder than she had imagined, and the isolation was worse. She had moved back in with her parents, unable to face her old life in the city. It was as though she had lost everything that had once defined her. But as she sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through the news on her phone, something caught her eye: an article about the airline's new initiatives to promote inclusion and diversity. The article highlighted the steps they had taken to combat unconscious bias and improve customer relations. It mentioned Isabella by name, describing her as the catalyst for the company's shift in perspective. Sarah's heart sank as she read through the piece. It felt like a punch to the gut. Isabella had won. The change was happening, and Sarah wasn't part of it. But as the anger and bitterness bubbled up inside her, another feeling emerged: guilt. And with that guilt came the realization that she needed to do something about it. Sarah knew that she had to make things right. She couldn't just sit back and let the system continue to perpetuate itself. She had a choice. She could continue to wallow in regret, or she could take the hard path, learn, grow, and become part of the change. The decision was clear. Sarah had spent so long believing she was doing the right thing by enforcing the status quo. Now she had to unlearn everything she had been taught. It wouldn't be easy, but it was the only path forward. Weeks later, Isabella stood before a crowd at a conference dedicated to diversity and inclusion in the workplace. She had been invited to speak about her experience and the changes she had helped bring to the airline industry. The room was packed, and as she looked out over the faces of the attendees, she felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. She spoke of the journey, how small acts of kindness and patience could lead to larger societal changes, how one person's quiet resolve could challenge systems that had been in place for generations. But she also spoke of the need for continued action. It wasn't enough to change policies. The real work lay in changing hearts and minds. After her speech, a young woman approached her. "I've been following your work," the woman said. "You've inspired me to stand up for what's right. I want to make a difference, too." Isabella smiled warmly, knowing that this was the moment she had been working toward, the ripple effect where her actions had inspired others to follow suit. This was how change happened. It wasn't instant, it didn't happen in a single moment, but it was coming, and she would keep fighting step by step until it did. The sun had set on another long day in the city, but for Isabella, it was more than just the end of a workday. It was the culmination of a journey that had changed her life and the lives of many others. As she walked out of the conference room after another meeting, she felt a quiet sense of pride. The airline had fully implemented the new diversity and inclusion policies she had fought so hard for, and the transformation was beginning to take shape. She had seen firsthand how the company's attitude had shifted over the past few months. Employees who once treated the issue of bias with indifference were now actively engaging in training, eager to make a difference. Um, a public apology to Isabella had been well received, but more importantly, the company had started a conversation that was long overdue. The industry as a whole was beginning to wake up, and Isabella had been the catalyst. Her phone buzzed as she stepped into the elevator and she checked the message. It was from one of the human rights advocates she had been working with. "Isabella, the board has approved the next phase of the project. We're moving forward with industry-wide workshops, and they want you to be the keynote speaker at the first one. Are you ready?" Isabella smiled, feeling the weight of the moment settle in. Yes, she was ready. More than ready. This wasn't just about one company anymore. It was about changing the way the world viewed fairness, equality, and human dignity. She had been the spark, but now the fire was spreading. Sarah stood in front of the mirror in her small apartment, staring at the reflection that looked back at her. It wasn't the same woman who had once walked into that flight with assumptions and prejudice in her heart. That woman had been broken down, exposed, and through that breaking, something new had emerged. It had taken time, and it hadn't been easy. After her termination, Sarah had enrolled in a series of workshops on diversity, unconscious bias, and social justice. At first, it had been uncomfortable, challenging the very foundation of everything she had been taught. But as the weeks passed, Sarah found herself embracing the discomfort, confronting the painful truths that had once been buried beneath the surface. She had reached out to organizations that focused on helping people who had fallen victim to bias, offering her time and support. It wasn't enough to simply apologize. It was about making reparations, understanding the impact of her actions, and using her position to amplify voices that had been silenced for too long. Her phone buzzed with a notification, a message from her old colleague at the airline. It was a simple note, a photo of the airline's new diversity initiative poster, with a message attached. "We're proud of you. You've made a difference." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming sense of hope that had grown within her. She had learned the hard way, but now she was on the path toward redemption. She wasn't the same person she had been when she first made that mistake. She had worked hard to undo the damage she'd done, and now she could see the light at the end of the tunnel. It was a week later when their paths crossed again. Isabella was in the airport terminal, preparing to board a flight to another conference when she saw Sarah walking toward her. It was unexpected, but not unwelcome. Sarah had reached out to her a few weeks prior, apologizing for her actions and expressing a desire to meet and discuss the changes she had made in her life. Isabella had agreed, but she hadn't known when or how the meeting would happen. As Sarah approached, her expression was open, a far cry from the defensive, uncertain look she had worn when they first met. She stopped a few feet away, her hands slightly trembling as she held them in front of her. "Isabella," Sarah began, her voice steady but filled with emotion, "I've thought about this moment for a long time. I want to thank you for pushing me to be better, for showing me the truth I didn't want to see. I was wrong about so many things." Isabella looked at her for a moment, taking in the change in Sarah's demeanor. There was no defensiveness now, only sincerity. Isabella could see that Sarah had done the hard work, that she had confronted her past and taken responsibility. "I'm proud of you, Sarah," Isabella said simply, her voice calm and genuine. "It's not easy to face the truth about yourself, to realize where you've failed, but you did it, and you're here now, working to make things right." Sarah's eyes welled up with tears, but she held them back. "I don't expect forgiveness from everyone, and I know I can't undo what I did, but I'm trying. I want to be part of the change now." Isabella nodded, her gaze softening. "That's all anyone can do. No one is perfect, but the willingness to change, that's what matters." The two women stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared history between them, but also the promise of something new. Neither of them knew exactly what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long time, they both felt hopeful. As Isabella walked through the terminal later that day, her thoughts turned back to the work ahead. She had already seen how the change she had started had rippled through the airline industry. The company's new policies were just the beginning. She had been invited to speak at conferences around the world, sharing her story and inspiring others to take action. She knew the work wasn't over. There was always more to do, more people to reach, more barriers to break down. But today, she felt something different. She felt a sense of peace, knowing that the journey was no longer just her own. Isabella's phone buzzed once more, and she checked the message. It was from the diversity board at the airline. "We're making progress. We've already seen a shift in how employees approach their work. We have you to thank for it. Keep pushing and keep leading the way." And so she would.